The former Deputy Director of Elections Operations in New York State, Joe Burns. Joe, how are you?
Good. How are you doing?
Doing okay.
Hey, Joe.
Thanks for having me.
Sure. Now, when were you the Deputy Director of Election Operations for New York State?
I started at the State Board of Elections in January 2009, and I left earlier this year. So it was about 6 years, I believe.
All right, and we're kind of interested about the tight elections here for the mayor of Rome and the mayor of Oneida, coming down to absentee ballots in both cases. There, have you experienced that before in some of these elections?
Oh yeah, no question. Actually, it wasn't too long ago. I was out in Oneida County just in September, counting ballots on behalf of Chris Jeruzzi in the primary. He was, as you know, elected city court judge in Utica.
Yep.
So sure, this happens frequently, and counties and the State Board of Elections have a process, and it usually gets done in an orderly and timely fashion, and we get a winner by January 1st.
Right, and when it comes to the absentee ballots, is it just ballots from the United States, and do you have to wait a little longer for votes coming from overseas, from servicemen?
You do. I mean, let's be honest. If you're mailing your absentee ballot from across town, it doesn't take as long as if you're mailing it from Afghanistan or Iraq or any number of other places. But you'd actually be surprised at how quickly the overseas mail does arrive. But servicemen and anybody else gets a period of time to get their ballots returned.
We've been talking to people about the absentee ballots in the cases of the Rome mayoral election and the Oneida mayoral election, and whether or not they normally tend toward the incumbent or favor the challenger, or if it's hard to predict. What's been your experience with that?
It's not always easy to predict. A good rule of thumb to go by is that they're simply going to reflect what you saw on Election Day. And it's not going to change that much. If you look at and it's very interesting because you have these two close races. In Rome, it certainly appears close, but when you get down to it, I think the top two finishers are separated by about 40-some votes. When you get down to it, it's pretty tough to overcome that, particularly in Rome, when you consider you have 4 different candidates, I believe.
Right.
So not only does the second place finisher, Mr. Fusco, the incumbent, not only does he have to get votes for himself and make sure that Ms. Izzo does not get votes. Any absentee votes that go to the Democrat or the Working Families candidate are of no help to him either. So he has quite a challenge it's not impossible, certainly, but he has quite a challenge in Rome. Oneida's a different story. In Oneida, Mr. Zogby is down by only 10. And I believe that there were 161 absentees sent out, and I think as of yesterday there were 123 received. That's a pretty close margin, and that would not surprise me. And there are other factors that go into this stuff. Did one candidate run an aggressive absentee program? Did the other candidate completely forget about it? There are other factors like that go into it, but I could certainly see Mr. Zogby overtaking the Democratic candidate and getting elected mayor.
What have been the most prominent examples you've been associated with of somebody coming from behind to win a race like this with the help of an absentee ballot?
The one that sticks out in my mind was the 2009 special congressional election in the greater capital region. Yep. This was the seat that was held by then Congresswoman Gillibrand, now Senator Gillibrand. She left Congress to become a U.S. Senator, and there was a special election between Scott Murphy and Assemblyman Jim Tedisco. On Election Day, Assemblyman Tedisco led by a decent margin. It was close by a decent margin. As the absentee counting went on, Mr. Murphy whittled down that lead and ended up overtaking it and winning it. And nobody will ever really know what the reason for that was. But the two theories that have been out there for a few years is, one, Mr. Murphy ran a more aggressive absentee program, and two, he was leading earlier on, and Assemblyman Tedisco came on strong at the end. So the folks casting their absentee ballots a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks before the election were much more favorable to Mr. Murphy than the folks who actually voted on Election Day. But that's probably the best example that I can think of someone who's down on Election Day coming back.
We're talking to Joseph Burns, former Deputy Director of Election Operations for New York State, here at 100.7 FM WUTQ.
And Joseph, you mentioned that election time in the Capital Region. I believe it was pretty interesting during that time with the special elections going on. Something that I brought up to David. It feels like we haven't stopped voting ever since that time in 2009. But I think George Amador also faced something similar, the senator at that time.
That's true. He was in a tight race in 2012. Certainly not a good year for Republicans like him. Mm-hmm. And I believe after all the absentees were counted, he lost by maybe a dozen or so votes.
Yeah, and that took some time. That was, I think, a few-month process.
There have been a few in recent years, Senate seats in particular, that it took so long, the winner was not able to be seated with the other senators come January 1st. And I think that year, his opponent, the eventual winner, Cecilia Tkachuk, I don't think she was seated until February.
You're right, yeah. She was waiting. I think she was preparing for that, but she kind of jumped in her position right at the last minute. And with that, I want to ask you were really instrumental in developing the changeover to the digital age for us here. You laugh. Was that a headache? Some of the things that you had to go through to make that happen?
I wasn't even there for the very early stages of it, but it was quite a process. It was quite an undertaking, and not a week goes by that somebody tells me how much they hate the new machines and wish we had the old lever machines.
And what are your thoughts on that? Would you rather have seen the old way?
Well, I mean, look, the lever machines were great. They served the people well for I think over a century. But look, there were any number of problems that they encountered, and when the federal government passed the Help America Vote Act, I think it was in 2002, we had to change over. The lever machines were not handicap accessible. Mm-hmm. They did not have a paper trail, which you have now with the optical scan machines. So the reality was we had to get rid of them, at least when we were using them in federal elections, which is every other year. There were, and I wasn't around when these decisions were being made, but there were other options that were out there. The optical scan machine was one, but the DRE was another machine that was considered, and eventually the state didn't go that way. But the DRE would have looked very similar to the lever machines, and you would essentially the voter would essentially be pushing a bubble. I think there's some people that are out there that say, we had that option, we should have gone with that.
What about increasing voter turnout by making it easier for people to vote if they're not even in person? I know Jordan Karp from the Oneida County Board of Elections was telling us about systems in use in Oregon and other places there. Feasible for New York State and elsewhere? What do you think?
There are a few states and larger jurisdictions that have all mail-in elections. I think that's right. I think Jordan's right that Oregon is one. I think Washington State has gone that way now too. I'm a skeptic. There are always thoughts out there about ballot fraud, and I can't see how having an all-mail election where you have all of these ballots sent to every voter. They're casting them in their homes. It just strikes me that there could be some nefarious things that go on. The other thing with that is we have certain provisions in the state constitution that restrict to some degree the use of absentee ballots.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think just because of that, I don't think that that's really feasible.
And Joe, just another question I'd like to ask you, kind of getting back to some of those special elections. You worked with Senator DeFrancisco, and he was tapped to maybe take the lead in the Senate for the majority. Your thoughts on that? Maybe why he didn't make it, or the reasoning behind Flanagan being?
Well, we'll probably never know what the actual decisions were from those 30-some men and women.
He seemed like a strong candidate.
Yeah, no, and I worked for him for 4 years. He's probably the smartest human being I've ever met in my life, and probably the hardest working human being I've ever met in my life. But sometimes the votes just aren't there. By all accounts, he gave it quite a run. Had a lot of support from particularly his upstate colleagues.
Sure.
And even some upstate party leaders.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes the votes just weren't there. And I think at the same time, John Flanagan, I think, has proven to be has been a pretty strong, pretty effective leader. And I think most Republicans, whether they're in the state legislature or the grassroots level, are pretty pleased with what he's been doing so far.
I think it was just. The folks here in upstate would really like to have seen that representation from a guy, coming out of Syracuse and maybe not the downstate influence. So.
Joe, I know you're a Syracuse transplant. You're living in Buffalo. How are the votes running right now for Bills coach Rex Ryan?
I think you'll have to. We'll have to wait for a few weeks. See what the absentees say.
Thanks for joining us. Appreciate it, Joe.